In the evening they came out upon a mesa that overlooked all the country to the north. The sun to the west lay in a holocaust where there rose a steady column of small desert bats, and to the north along the trembling perimeter of the world dust was blowing down the void like the smoke of distant armies. The crumpled butcher paper mountains lay in sharp shadow fold under the long blue dusk, and in the middle distance the glazed bed of a dry lake lay shimmering like the mare Imbrium, and herds of deer were moving north in the last of the twilight, harried over the plain by wolves who were themselves the color of the desert floor.
Wow. Hi, JVH. How you doing?
Hi, Candy. I'm doing okay. It's been a really busy month.
Oh my God. You and I both. You more than me. So
I
you've got
don't
a lot
know.
going on. I feel bad for you. Your workload is heavy. And I broke my foot
Oh,
since we
you
last
broke your
talked. Yeah.
foot. Yeah, I know.
The good news is it wasn't really a broken foot. When I went back for follow-up, the orthopedic doctor said I broke the inside of my baby toe. So that's good news.
Oh, okay. That is
Yeah,
good news.
it is good news because I didn't have to wear that boot anymore. I'll tell you, the pain in my foot had nothing to do with the compensation in the rest of my body for limping.
That is always the case.
Yeah, and then someone on Facebook said you shouldn't walk around. The toe needs to heal, and if it doesn't heal, it will be dead. It was so blood meridian. I was like, dude.
Nice.
So in paranoia, I laid on the couch for 3 days. It is great to see you on video here and great to hear your voice. We got a hell of a chapter again, yet again in Blood Meridian, chapter 8.
Chapter 8, yes.
Yes, and I love that paragraph you read because it mentions Mare Imbrium, which is a volcanic rock left over from maybe 3 billion years ago or smashing into the earth. That's one theory.
Right, yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
well, yeah, there's that one theory about the origin of the moon,
Mm,
like there was a a massive like comet or something like that that hit the Earth where maybe the Pacific Ocean basin is now, and so the Earth gave birth to the moon.
I love it.
But I don't think that's actually like a viable theory in
No.
astronomy anymore. Not that I know much about it, but I
However,
think I've read, yeah, anyways.
there is dust from that event, the Mare Imbrium, on the face of the moon facing us. So maybe that's the connection.
It could be, yeah.
Right away, though, we want to thank everybody for listening. We can see people are listening. Two people sent us messages. We really appreciate that. And
Thank you, two people.
yeah, for sending us a message in our DMs on Instagram or Facebook, whatever it takes. We do have a Substack page with supplemental content, so you can reach us there too, or email us at Blood Meridian Now, to Blood Meridian Now at Gmail. Um, but yeah, I wanted to do a quick shout out too. So to anyone who might be listening, I just want to rev us all up here. I want to say hi to Nell, Rick, Wes, Marcus, my sister Kiki, Dev, Russell, Kelly, Dave, Martina, Marty, Cody, Brett, George, Nicolette, Jesper, Ryan, and Miles. If you're out there listening, we really appreciate it. If you email us, we'll know that you're listening. Let us know what you think.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And so we do have two listeners' responses, which we're going to read. And then we talked about what are we going to focus on when we're preparing for this episode. And we considered among our themes some of these themes. So we don't know which ones we're going to get to, but I'll give you a little preview of coming attractions in this episode. So the ideas of raciality in the novel, religion, ceremony, sacrifice, capitalism, gambling, cards, gaming, identity within environment. So we'll see where it goes from there. We just don't know sometimes.
That's a tall order.
It is a tall order, even though we have substantive notes. So how do you what are you thinking? What are you thinking, JVH? Um,
I always like to look for, in this process of rereading and slow reading and going chapter by chapter. I'm kind of more interested in like the coherence of the chapter itself. So I've been looking for, like what is, how does this chapter stick together? What are the things that sort of are going on in this particular chapter? And I guess, and it took a while, I think, for us to come up with some ideas. I think we passed through this chapter before today at least two or three times, maybe, or something like that. And um, it's again a kind of a short chapter. It's broken into two sections. In each section, there seems to be a killing. So there are some nice, there's symmetry to the chapter, and one of the most interesting kind of symmetrical things going on is that there's a word that appears in two different forms. So bookending this chapter, and it took me, a bit of time to kind of notice this and then kind of start thinking about it.
Hmm.
But the first word is, so like this chapter kind of like it's been a while since we we did the last episode, so like trying to remember what's going on. So in the last episode, in chapter 7, when we were looking at it, the kid is finally like with the Glanton gang. The Glanton gang has gone to a couple of places, and they end up in, I think, the town of Janos. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but like Janus, the Roman goddess of who has two faces. That's interesting. But so the chapter 7 ends in this town, and chapter 8 begins in the town still. And basically, at the opening of the chapter, we have three Walking Dead men essentially, Bath Cat, Toad Vine, and the Kid. And I say those names in the order of their
Hmm.
deaths
Wow.
in the novel, I guess. They go to a bar, right? I think you probably mentioned this before. Alcohol is like flowing in every chapter, it
Yeah.
seems like, of this novel, and so they go to the bar. They need a drink, right? And so they go to this little cantina, and the in the first paragraph we read how the three cowboys basically approached the bar, and the bartender, who's a thin little man, appeared before them and placed his hands, and here's the adverb of interest to me, ceremonially
Hmm.
upon the tiles.
Mhm.
So, my eyes probably have passed over that word 1,000 times and not really taken too much note of them. But again, if we go back to if we leap forward to the end of this chapter, chapter 8, this is the scene where Black Jackson decapitates White Jackson, and that's the end of White Jackson's appearance in the two short chapters that he appears in the novel. And so we read, when Black Jackson kills or murders White Jackson, he kills him with a knife, with his humongous Bowie knife.
Hmm.
And we read that. When he steps out of the darkness bearing the Bowie knife in both hands like some instrument of ceremony. So we have, this word ceremony appearing at the beginning and at the end. At the beginning in an adverbial form, which is, basically a kind of a simile in some sense, a kind of a buried compare or like simile, that this man places his hands ceremonially upon the tiles as if this was a ceremony and not
Mhm.
just ordering a drink at a bar, or
Mhm.
maybe that is a ceremony.
Mhm.
But we have, ceremonially appear at the beginning, and then embedded in one of McCarthy's amazing similes, we have, like an instrument of ceremony. So I think in a way, it might be good for us to talk about, you know, why does this word appear at the beginning and the end? What is McCarthy's interest in ceremony? Maybe here in this particular chapter, but obviously maybe also throughout the novel. I'm thinking way ahead to the end of the novel when when the kid and the judge reunite in the bar in Fort Griffin, and the judge starts talking about ceremonies, war as a ceremony, war as a dance, and and all of this kind of stuff about all of these kind of conflation of ideas once again reappear in this in the end of the novel. So whatever ceremony means to McCarthy, it means something because it appears, and I think it's worth us talking about.
I do too. And two things come to mind. One is that at n- that I feel like there's a, it was a subtle chapter at first. And then I realize, we often think that there's a diversity happening in this novel with you've got a Mexican in the gang, you've got Delaware's black. It's trying to be a diverse community. Yet chapter 7, it's been really bugging me. Glanton doesn't do anything when the two Jacksons are having mind games. And that's complicit consent, in my opinion, since he's the leader. It really bothered me once we get into this chapter and we find out that this comes to a head by the end of the chapter. I just want to throw that in there. Because, we're talking about the portrayal of race and how the, the gang is. Later in the novel, though, there is some standing up for people being welcomed in the gang. There might be a little bit this chapter about the fires, what fire you sit at, but there's some point about what table you sit at and where you belong. And Glanton says, you're not going to get these guys to move. They're not moving, they're staying together. So they've become a band of brothers of some kind. Not right away, though. Second, you're talking about this mirroring of ceremonially and ceremony, and that's incredible. You noticed it. It reminds me of the mirror or the bookends in the chapter titles. Of course, we have another cantina
Oh yes, yeah.
and another advisor, and then at the end we have another anchorite and another dawn. Now that's four anothers, which are an other, and that hints to the number 8 to me in chapter 8.
Well,
Be
if you count the words in both of those
correct.
subheadings, it's 8 words.
It's 8 words. Plus, if you have four and other, that means those are pairs. Another is a pair. So yeah, it's interesting that in chapter 8 we've got that, and there's some work done on the number of 8 in the novel. I think Shane has done that, Shane Schimpf, and I've seen a few websites and I've done a number of exploring what does that mean. And it's just an interesting mirror. And I love it. Of course, it's in chapter 8, chapter title. So that's what came to my head.
I
Hi
had a
there.
I had a former
I'm
professor.
recording. Don't mind me. It's my
I
family.
had
That's
a
my roomie.
I had a former professor who lived in a house, and I think the house number was 1008.
Hmm.
And he actually, I think, got up on a ladder and tipped the 8 over so it becomes the symbol of infinity.
I love that. That's adorable. It still got the mail, I'm sure.
I
Well,
guess so.
yeah, and I've talked about this before in the past, but in Canada, a lot of people change their numbers of their addresses. The the word in Mandarin or Chinese for four is the same as death.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, no, we got to change that number. They can't sell houses. Um, yeah, so very interesting. I like the ceremonial thing, which hints at sacrifices, because it makes the murder that happens at the end of the novel, it suggests it might be a sacrifice.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I went to the OED and, like what is, how do you define ceremony? An outward rite or observance, religious or held sacred, the performance of some solemn act according to prescribed form, a solemnity.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it's kind of funny that, ceremony is, well, in the first place, it's ordering a drink at a bar, and in the second place, it's like this horrible murder.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I want to kind of like a event like now for a little bit, and maybe throughout the rest of the podcast too, like talk about ceremony or ritual, also in terms of reading and making art.
Mhm.
Uh, like one of my first ideas, or the first text that I went to in my associative brain was like Leslie Marmon Silko's novel Ceremony, which would, like at some point it might be worth like talking about. Or in any case, when I teach a seminar on Blood Meridian next year, I think I'm putting Silko's novel Ceremony on it as well. Silko is a Laguna, so a, a Pueblo person, and a lot of the action of Blood Meridian takes place in traditional Puebloan territory when they bivouac at that cliff, that massive cliff complex of houses and stuff like that. That's formal or former Puebloan, you know um, it's a dwelling or whatever. And Silko, like, writing Ceremony about, the novel is about a World War II veteran who comes back and he has PTSD and stuff like that, and how do you deal with the PTSD, and the answer in Silko's novel is in part, well, return to the traditional ceremonies of your people, and ceremony is a kind of a ritual form of healing as well, like, so I think we have this large like scope of possible meanings, that sort of hover around the term ceremony, and one of them is like a healing thing. And Silko, I think, originally wanted to write Ceremony, after her own experience of depression, and how not only the traditional ceremonies of her people were helping her through this, but writing itself as a kind of a ceremony. And that also got me going back, because I'm trained in like Western literature that had me going back immediately to Aristotle's Poetics, and the idea that Aristotle had that art has this social function, and that function is catharsis. And well, what does catharsis mean? I mean, this term Aristotle takes from at least two different very distinct discourses in ancient Greece. On the one hand, the discourse of medicine, where catharsis means purging or purgation, vomiting up your pity and your fear and your emotions, so that when you leave the theater, you can be, a emotionally well-regulated citizen and stuff like that. Aristotle is also kind of responding to the kind of cheeky or ironic denigration of art that Plato wrote about in the Republic through his mouthpiece Socrates. So on the one hand, catharsis is this kind of purging. We're filled with all these emotions. The tragedy or the comedy helps bring them out of us, and we either laugh or we cry, and we purge our emotions, and then we're once again, we can leave the theater governed by our reason. But the other discourse that Aristotle gets the idea of catharsis from is from religious ceremonies, initiation ceremonies into the Eleusinian mysteries and stuff like that. So here, catharsis also means kind of a purification, in preparation for something, in preparation to receive some kind of mystery.
Mm.
So, talking about art as ceremony, we can, think about, I guess, the social function of art as a healing tool. We can talk about the social function of art as something that purges us of our excesses, or something that not purifies us, the
Mm.
reader, but rather purifies the narrative content itself, right? Like Aristotle also said, like the difference between history and poetry was that when you write history, you're writing a particular thing that happened, and this happened in this place at this time, and maybe it had to happen that way. That's a philosophical question of determinism or whatever. But in any case, it's very local and specific. But art is supposed to, even if you base a piece of art on a historical event, that like Cormac McCarthy does with Blood Meridian, You still have to purify or cathart the story itself of its merely local significance,
Hmm.
right? And you make it into what Aristotle would say, if history is more, particular, poetry aims for the universal, and the Greek word for that is, an English word too now. It's Catholic, right? So, art aims not to recount what actually happened, but in some ways to restore the actual back to its maybe essence as something merely possible, and therefore something that can connect to other moments other than itself. So, anyway, this is kind of like the way I've been thinking a little bit about ceremony, but you know, even in that passage that I read, that word Holocaust is mentioned, and of course, that word to everyone who has lived past 1945, that obviously means something very specific. It refers to the German genocide of Jewish people, and the Jewish, I believe, like. In Judaism, the Holocaust is more properly referred to as Shoah, which just means the pit,
Hmm.
um, which is maybe even a more horrifying kind of word.
Hmm.
Um, but Holocaust originally kind of meant also was a kind of ceremony, but this is not a healing ceremony. Well, in a way, it can be taken as a positive ceremony, but it is a bloodletting sort of ceremony. Holocaust originally refers to, a kind of a sacrifice, and especially a sacrifice by fire.
Mm.
Uh, and so, like, Holocaust was also, something associated with particularly destructive, fiery events.
Mm.
So we also have this kind of darker um, um, sort of association with the idea of ceremony as something of a kind of a sacrifice, and especially a blood sacrifice. And since there are two murders in this chapter, one I assume that the son of the Mexican who accosts our three cowboys. I assume he dies. He
Mm.
gets cut in this game of Monty, and he's crying out to God, and or rather to the mother of God, I should say. Um, and again, like White Jackson's murder, in a way, also we could maybe think about it as maybe we can think about it as sacrifice, or it's hard not to, I guess, think about killing in relation to the idea of sacrifice, although that's again highly problematical.
Hmm. Well, it is. I mean, there's certainly a long tradition. I mean, it's beyond tradition. It's universal almost. Speaking of universal, of sacrifice, um, going to the gods. What's
Yes.
interesting is that we may be having something else here that you've hinted at when you reminded me when in an email to check out capitalism as religion. What's interesting is that always the slaughter was around births, marriages, funerals, um, graduation from puberty, whatever it's called in different
Yep.
regions and different societies. But the slaughter was always had this function. Um, and related to killing of why would you kill somebody who is playing in a card game? So in the beginning chapter, there's a card game going on, Monty. We don't know if it's the shell game or if it's the Spanish card game. It probably is a Spanish card game. And those
Yes.
cards are interesting because they have some symbols like tarot cards with the coins and wands, I believe, and a star, which is like a pentagram, right? Um,
Yes.
so he's killed. What's the benefit of killing somebody? Well, he's just never going to pay up, so he's costing too much money to lend him, maybe. Maybe it's that. White Jackson dying makes the gang stronger.
It 100% makes the gang stronger.
Yeah. And we did slaughters usually over the years. You do a slaughter because it's redistribution festivals, okay, in anthropology. So you're having this, and it's very seldom humans. Very. I mean, cannibalism is very rare. Aztecs aside, that's a different kind of thing, which we could look at. We might get to that. Um, but definitely it's unusual that because people just don't give enough food. You kill people because they're not cost effective. It's simply not cost effective to one of the reasons they're wiping out so many people with the scalps and trying to win this war is one, they have to prove that they've killed them, right? So it's a very lightweight proof, and that goes all the way back to oh shit, Heracles. I'm going to say his name wrong. So
Heraclita?
yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. Where they still brought scalps because they were light to carry, and that they wanted to get part of their. They showed the king their scalps because it was light to carry and get their plunder. It's to prove their worth, just like it is in Blood Meridian. Um, but this you can't if you can't convert the people to your way of life, they're not useful. They're actually a hazard. And you also have to have enough food to give them. So in Aztec community, the reason they did do the cannibalism, they did not have meat source. They didn't have guns, germs, and steel, Jared Diamond. They didn't have domesticated animals like we do in America or in Europe. They just simply did not have that food source. They didn't have sheep or cows. So there was no benefit in having slaves or human proletariats because they just couldn't feed them. When you've got the Industrial Revolution and you've got totalitarian agriculture, you can feed all kinds of poor people and they can be your minions, right? Um, I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but it does relate to the part where we've lost the reason for ceremony with the slaughter. There's certainly a minimal of ceremony in Blood Meridian in terms of the deaths. So it's very interesting that he starts out the chapter and ends it with that word.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of the Aztecs, I guess I didn't know about, food scarcity or whatever, or, their food security issues, as we might say today.
Mhm,
But that's really interesting to me because in terms of human sacrifice, um, in Aztec culture, what little I know is something like the following. Well, in general, blood sacrifice was important in Aztec culture because I believe that the Aztecs had their religion was focused around the sun.
mhm,
And the sun was, well, hey, we started the podcast talking about how in this theory about the origin of the moon, like the Earth gave birth to the moon. But I think the Aztecs believed that the Earth was somehow gave virgin birth to the sun
mhm,
after having given birth to the moon and the stars.
mhm,
And I guess after the Earth gave birth to the moon and the stars, the Earth vowed that never again would, I guess, she have, uh, like, never again would she, like, conceive or something like that. But this was, like, not a conception along the usual route of commingling or whatever, although I don't know who the Earth's original um, baby daddy was who gave birth to the moon and the stars. But um, the moon and the stars were furious that the Earth gave birth to the sun,
Oh,
and or that the Earth was pregnant again.
mm,
And so they threatened the Earth, with destruction or something.
mm,
And then the sun springs forth out of the Earth the way Athena springs forth out of the head of Zeus, fully armed and ready to fight.
mm.
And so the sun drives back the moon and the stars and has to do that every day, right? That's why we
Right.
have day. The sun is driving back the onslaught of the moon and the stars. But the sun, also needs nourishment. So there's food, issues with the sun, and the best food for the sun was blood, and
Mhm.
the best blood was human blood because that was the most sacred of all types of blood.
Mhm,
So the Aztecs had various kinds of blood sacrifices, including what maybe now today we would call cutting yourself.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so people would cut themselves regularly and offer the blood that came from those cuts as nourishment for the sun. But human sacrifice, where an entire person is put to death, this was the most powerful form
Mm.
of blood sacrifice around because the human being was at its peak value. The human being is the most sacred being, and therefore their sacrifice was the most powerful form of blood around. And what's really interesting is something that I remember reading about this is that, like, well, where do you get these human sacrifices? Sometimes children were sacrificed involuntarily, maybe. I think that's probably the case. But most often, the human sacrifices came from captured warriors
Yes, enemies.
and enemies. And there's a wonderful, speaking of ceremonies, there's a really interesting ceremony also in relation to Blood Meridian, is that when somebody is captured and has been determined, fit for sacrifice, there is a verbal exchange that takes place between captor and captive, where the captive apparently voluntarily says, "You are like my father,"
Mm,
and the captor says to the captive, "You are like my son."
mm,
Because again, not only is the human being the most valuable of all possible sacrifices because their blood is the most sacred, but also because, what would be the greatest sacrifice imaginable? The sacrifice of your child.
mhm,
So this simile, which is really interesting, and remember that later in the novel, the judge will say to the kid, "I
mhm.
could have loved you like a son, so you are like my son.
Yes.
You should be the one, like who I sacrifice," or something like that.
Right, right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, that it is weird. I'm still like I'm still wondering where is the link here. And I think it is here is just the building the community for sure of the gang. There's why you would justify that, you know? And I guess that it's odd that at that time period, people must have known right away they could not, and they could not convert Mexicans. Maybe Spain had already tried it. It was very difficult. They couldn't convert Spaniards to giving up and becoming part of the states, because usually that's what the sacrifice would be. And yeah, you'd kill your if you don't have enough to support your captives, your prisoners of war, then they've got to go for sure. In
it's like the what happened at Mir, right? From
Yeah,
when we were talking about
yeah,
that before,
yeah,
the Mexican penal system just could not handle all the prisoners,
right.
so they came up with this white bean, black bean
Mhm,
sort of thing to determine who dies and who lives.
mhm. And with
Um,
children, that was really, you're right. There's so much history of children being sacrificed in Tophets is one of the words for burning children. In Jeremiah 7:31, King 23:10 is talking about being sacrificed to Moloch. Well, I'm sure you know who that is. Early Assyrians documented burning of children on sacrificial offerings. I'm guessing, as a cultural materialist, I would say that's probably a form of late stage birth control, population control. I don't know if a family has too many children. I mean, I don't know those details, but I'm guessing that certainly it would keep people in line too. If you wouldn't want your children to be brought out like kings in Egypt, once they died, every one of their servants, every one of their wives, their concubines had to die too. Um, and that's so that the new king can come in and a new regime. However, it's also very handy if you are a king, knowing that your staff, they're going to die with you, you can kind of trust them better. It's to their value to keep you alive, right? It's a
that makes
financial
sense.
investment. It's to their value to keep you alive. So we have all kinds of economies that go with these sacrifices and ceremonies.
Yeah, like in ancient Hebrew, like obviously like the story of Abraham and Isaac has often been read as a kind of like this is the moment when the Hebrews like overcame the ideology of human sacrifice, and then began with animal substitutes, right? And so,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, what I was going to say is sort of also like, again, it's kind of interesting that for the Aztecs, the firstborn child, son especially, is the most valuable thing you can ever sacrifice.
Mhm.
And I believe the ancient Hebrews kind of thought the same thing, right? That's hence Isaac is being sacrificed or something like that, and you have the establishment of the priestly caste in ancient Hebrew. It was sort of like a substitute sacrifice, right? The firstborn son had to join the priestly caste,
Mhm.
um, and,
Mhm.
and that was sort of like a symbolic sacrifice of the firstborn.
Yeah, I
And
think you'd see that in the Catholic Church too, of priests in a family.
yeah, and like the whole Christian story of Christ as ultimately a kind of self-sacrifice, um, that that wasn't really even in the original gospel stories. There in the gospels, I don't think you're going to really find mention of, Christ's crucifixion or Jesus' crucifixion as a sacrifice. Rather, what the gospels focused on was the miraculous fact of the resurrection, right? And it was only later when Paul was trying to establish the Christian church that, and trying to think of trying to justify why Jesus didn't immediately return after his resurrection, and so we have this indefinite postponement of the second coming. But it was Paul who started to massage the Jesus story into the Christ story of a sacrifice for for again a universal or a Catholic sacrifice for
Mhm.
all of humanity.
Interesting.
Um, but and if that this kind of does remind me of, the function of religion in general. And you mentioned Walter Benjamin's little essay,
Well, you
Capitalism.
mentioned it to me, so I got involved in it, which I just want to quickly go back. Most sacrifices were animals. For weddings, funerals, all of that was mostly animals, just to be clear. I think it's only when there's resource scarcity and competing for food that we might see the human sacrifice. And as again, a reminder, the Aztecs weren't um, sacrificing people in their statehood, in their city. They were sacrificing dozens of other cultures that lived beside them, right? They would capture one of them who could not be converted because they lived outside. And in fact, when the ideas, when when it collapsed, the empire, it wasn't because somebody came up with a good idea. It's because they just walked away. They went back into living in the jungle where there was like lots of food. And
So
yes,
yeah, well, like sacrifice as a part of a ceremony in some senses always seeks a kind of rebalancing or like equilibrium. um and in a religious context, the idea sort of religion sort of trucks with the idea of guilt and the idea of atonement, right? And there are all sorts of religious ceremonies that are geared toward atonement, like confessing your sins, you become atoned to God, and all of this. I kind of am slowly trying to move toward something that the Mexican says to the three cowboys in the bar about where he writes, or where he says, blood, this country is give much blood. This Mexico, this is a thirsty country, the blood of 1,000 Christs, nothing,
mm,
right? So
mm,
here to me, like in with respect to Walter Benjamin's idea of capitalism, not as coming from a religion or developing out of a religion, which was his precursor Max Weber's thesis, and the spirit of capitalism out of Christianity, that famous sociological book.
mhm,
But Benjamin wanted a more radical sort of idea that capitalism itself was a religion. But unlike every other religion that has ever existed, capitalism does away with all rituals of atonement.
Mhm.
And so, Benjamin says that capitalism as a religion is only interested in the intensification of guilt and the perfecting of despair.
Mm.
So there is no atonement in capitalism. There is only going into debt even further. And so, like this idea of that the blood of a thousand Christs is nothing, is
Mm.
the idea that, you know, all of your attempts at atonement, will fail over and over and over again. And we could make the case that Blood Meridian is a representation of this idea of the perfecting of despair, because the book ends with the judge's victory. The book ends with no atonement for anybody. It is a perfection of despair.
Thank you.
And the judge also will talk about despair,
Mhm.
that the only thing worth doing is taking up arms against despair. And he says that even as he himself is the embodiment of despair and the impossibility of atonement.
Well, I think that it's so brilliant that you suggested checking out this essay, which I had completely forgotten about. I talked to a college friend that I'm going to see next week, and he's telling me what he's doing. And I said, "Well, I just read Capitalism as Religion." I sounded really impressive because he was doing his PhD in sociology when we used to know each other when we were younger. And it's like we've reversed lifestyles. And now I'm reading what he used to read. But it's funny because one thing about the whole world in religion, almost everywhere you go, most people who look to a religion and they have a negotiation that if you are good to the gods and you have faith in God or gods or deities, you're going to get some benefits, right? It's just everywhere. In
Quid
my,
pro quo.
yeah, so when you're doing these sacrifices, it's one to get rain or to get
Right.
maybe I want immortality or I want there's a number of what do we like? We like immortality, resurrection, eternal bliss. These are the things we're hoping for in a kind of an emotional or spiritual way. And in a more a practical way, we want recovery from illness. We want success in our work life. We want rain and victory for war. So there's this thing. But what's interesting about this capitalism as a religion is I'm not seeing that. You just said how it ends in despair and guilt, and there isn't somehow we lost the rituals, we've lost the kind of steps of initiation or whatever. We're just straight on profit. The only reward you get is profit, only if you're in a certain realm within capitalism. So there is no there the guilt, like you said, it goes back. There's what are you wishing for? You're wishing so you can buy a new Kate Moss purse? Not Kate Moss, Kate Spade purse or Louboutin or the newest video game or something. That's what our benefit is. Our sweat is what do I get to negotiate as a working class person or under $70,000 a year? What do I get to buy with my little extra bit of money? If you get there, certainly it's $10,000 to go to Disneyland. Fucking, what's his name? Baudrillard would roll over right now. Who's the guy that wrote about Disney?
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. He'd be like, you guys are nuts. I thought I cleaned this up for you. I thought I cleared this up. Yeah, so I think you're very smart on pointing that out. And I think it really is related to Blood Meridian intensely. Obviously, selling scalps, making a living in war, although we've always done it. That's why I wanted to point out that it's new, but it's come where there's no honor. We know they lie about it. They've cut off an old woman's head, scalp in chapter 7, and that's playing out now, like with their reward, and they're going to keep it and sell it. There's no community, and there's no gauge on the community, and it's just worse.
this chapter kind of confirms that the old woman who was shot and that who was scalped in the last chapter, that she was indigenous, because she the narrator uses like the S word or whatever
Hmm.
to describe her. And so what that actually meant is like in that like sad murder, and in the scalping of that woman, the Glanton gang made about $100
Yeah.
because I believe the bounties at around this time for scalps were like $250 for men
Yes.
and warriors and $100 for women and children.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. Might
So it was
even.
$100,
Yeah.
easy money.
So easy money, which would be, I guess, $4,000 today, because I think the 200 was 8,000. We looked that up last one of the early episodes. But it's heartbreaking. Plus the wisdom, plus thousands of years of wisdom, and again that symbolization with the scalping. You're taking their mind away, and you pointed out to me as well in your notes that there's another beheading. Now we have two white people beheaded.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I don't know if I don't recall offhand, and we haven't seen any yet, but I think those are the only two beheadings in the novel, and it is funny that it's like Captain White and White Jackson,
Yes, it is.
and that in a way it like to spin that positively, or at least in my radical left-wing lunacy, that's like McCarthy, decapitating white supremacy two
Mhm.
times over just to make the reader like, did you miss it the first time? Here
Totally,
it is again.
totally.
That was pretty funny. And yeah, like talking about capitalism and especially guilt and despair. Guilt as a word, I think, at least in its Germanic origins, like this is like probably coming from my reading of Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals or something like that, where guilt is originally the concept was just pure debt, not like moral wrongness, requiring some kind of atonement, but you owe, something material to the person who has subjugated you. And so debt, the idea of guilt is first and foremost the idea of debt. And I'm going to come back to this actually later in a chapter that you've already alluded to with the
Okay.
um, when we read from the narrator that the judge quotes the pre-Socratic philosopher Anaximander. I'll just leave that for now, but
Yeah. Yeah.
um, the idea of there is no atonement. There is only kind of the intensification of guilt slash debt
Hmm.
and the perfecting of despair. So on the one hand, we have this kind of total system, economic system that is in a way like more determining of individuals, people's lives than, the previous European model of feudalism, where you're born into, an estate and that's where you live and that's where you die. In some ways, like the system of capitalism is more totalizing and more determining. And since there is no atonement, despair can only increase, to the stars type of thing. Um, and when we despair of, our fate in this kind of economic system, this maybe lends a greater intensity to things like gambling. Like gambling is in a way, on the one hand, life is a giant gamble every day. You gamble with the little money you have and you hope to make more money.
Hmm.
But at the actual gaming table, again, I'm again kind of channeling Walter Benjamin. At the gaming table, there's this almost kind of transcendent moment where maybe the gods will smile on me and maybe I'm gonna win that big pot, like and for a moment things will look better. Or, on the other hand, you gamble all you have and it's just like a kind of ekphrastic moment of intensity, or like where it's like I put everything and like it's either total catastrophe or like, a massive rescue, and like, and feeling that horrible emotion as the dice land or the cards are turned over, that's a moment of ecstasy
Yeah.
and almost a transcendence in a world that otherwise has more or less suppressed even the idea of the possibility of transcendence.
Well, it is interesting that that these two deaths occur in community settings, right? In the bar where you're supposed to be having fun, and they
Yeah.
are gambling. And then which can be fun for sure. And it does activate the dopamines, hence its idea of being a process addiction. And then when they're around the
Yeah.
campfire. And the thing is, if these are sacrifices, and you look at sacrifice, sacrifice is it's an expression of love. It's an expression of gratitude. And it's associated with harmful action. Yes, you're giving something up. So has it come to the place where instead of slaying a loved one or self-mutilation, we're playing gambling games in a pub and we're carrying that hate to our fellow person at the campfire. I mean, it's been shifted. That's what I was trying to say about this. Capitalism has shifted what was all within a structure of very highly thousands of years of organized behavior, codes of ethics. We've lost that with capitalism. And I think we can see that more and more in many news stories. That there's just there's no sacrifice. Your sacrifice is that you go to your job. It's not a real sacrifice of love and gratitude. Even in the romantic idea of the 40s and the 50s, you had barbecues with your companies. Your boss gave you turkeys and your kids' Christmas gifts, in America. Now, maybe at Facebook, maybe at Google, you get that kind of community. Maybe at elite corporations, maybe.
But the Facebook community is mediated by technology, and we're basically paying rent to our new techno-feudal overlords. And
True,
so it's not, yeah, I mean, I
true.
think,
I
yeah,
meant the office
that's a
space.
whole
That's
other
a whole
question.
other, yeah. I was thinking of the actual office space of corporations where they try to treat their pays all their employees $200,000 a year or something.
Wow.
Yes, I read his book. It was pretty interesting. Yeah.
So, like you mentioned the tarot
Yes.
earlier, and I had another kind of tarot moment in this
Oh,
chapter,
oh.
which is again like has to do with the first part of the chapter in the bar. And so again, we get these, the Three Stooges, right? Bath Cat,
Yeah.
Toadvine, and the kid,
Yeah.
and they come in, and like um, I think McCarthy is careful to use the word cup, and he uses it in interesting ways. So like he writes, where am I here? Let me try to find my place.
Yep.
Oh yeah, I mean there's another incredible simile. The barman poured the measures from a clay jar. There's the word clay, by the way,
Yeah.
into three dented tin cups and pushed them forward with care like counters on a board. And
Mm.
that again, that simile like counters on a board, your eyes could just pass over that and like, okay, whatever that is, let's keep moving on. But he's talking about board games.
Mhm.
It's a game of chance, a war game, counters, like it's again like the way that McCarthy kind of like builds thematic resonances about the ideas that he's playing with. So we're talking about gambling, we're talking about games of chance, and all of that, even in this like fairly unobtrusive simile like counters on a board, we get this thematic working through again, and it's really interesting. So we have these three guys who drink from three cups, right? So when I read that, I'm like, okay, where's the fourth cup? There's got to
Mm.
be a fourth cup, because in the Rider Waite illustration by Patricia Coleman of the Four of Cups, we have this young wastrel sitting leaning against a tree. There are three cups before him that seem to have been drained, and in the air, a mysterious hand appears and offers him a fourth cup. But whether he notices it or not, whether he notices it and rejects it, or whether he doesn't even notice it, that's a whole other question. But so I was looking for this fourth cup, and and here comes this Mexican guy. A man was shuffling toward them out of the gloom. He had a bottle under his arm, and he set it on the tiles with care, together with his cup. And he spoke to the barman. So here's the fourth cup, right? And it to me, like it's interesting because this man is, he's a thinker, right? Like he's talking about, the blood of 1,000 Christs is nothing. He's talking about, dreams that he's had, and he's pointing to his chest, and he's like, I don't need to go to a church. It's here where I pray. So like he's a like maybe a kind of instructor, guide type figure of a way out for the kid. But once again, the kid just it flies over his head, right? Like the figure in the Four of Cups. He they basically Bath Cat and Toadvine, they say this guy's crazy, or like he's full, I think, which probably means he's like totally drunk or he's crazy, like so they just dismiss this guy and everything that he's saying.
Very perceptive. It's so true. It is so true. And he's the advisor, you know? Um, and I've mentioned this before, a bar is like an altar. And back to sacrifice, God's like what we like. And one of the things they really, really like is booze. Well, they like that animal meat being sacrificed. It never goes to waste because the gods don't need the physical. It gets back into that's part of the redistribution, and it would be a spiritual meal at that point, right? But the booze, yeah. So the funny that the booze is gods love booze, so you're always going to have booze being donated to offerings. So it's kind
And
of
it's
in that way.
it's it's in this section too where we get this, I guess, a kind of a metaphor. The Mexican has said, "This is a thirsty country. The blood of 1,000 Christ is nothing." And then, we read, he made a gesture toward the world beyond, where all the land lay under darkness, and all a great stained altar stone.
Mm-hmm.
There is the, perfect image of sacrifice, and also an image that we're going to get at the very end of the Border trilogy with the traveler's dream about an altar stone and a sacrifice.
Yes, definitely. Very
And
much.
like it does kind of remind me, like the whole idea of sacrifice. I think we've talked about this in previous episodes. But you said that one of our listeners was asking about Moby Dick and stuff like
Oh,
that. And
yeah.
I do remember that, like in Whales and Men, um, one of the characters says something like, we pursue it, like on the surface, we're, pursuing whales to extinction for profit, right? And this is like, the infinity of debt, we will drive this to extinction rather than, you know, trying to figure out what's sustainable, we'll just keep going until there's nothing left.
Mm,
But the idea that McCarthy had was that, on the surface we are pursuing this thing for profit, because that's the economy. But even behind this kind of more modern justification of whale hunting, there's this feeling of we don't understand the whale.
mm,
We can't understand that, and the whale is like a mystery in with a capital M, and we have to sacrifice what we don't understand.
hmm.
And so, there's again, I guess that's also sort of like you know an idea that can be put into the common of of our conversation.
Yeah, we could. Should we read those comments right now that we got, those messages?
We can, yeah,
Why don't we? And then we'll carry on with the rest of our topics.
sure.
They're in our, I can read one if you want to get prepared to read Jesper's. It's in our texts. Or I
Okay,
can read them both. Or I can read them both. Well, here's Jesper's. I'll read this.
okay,
Hi. And he sent this, I think, through one of our in our in one of our messages. You can message us even on social media or on our podcast page. So here's one. Hi, I have been listening to all your episodes and I really love them. I reread Blood Meridian recently and find it even more amazing the second time. Since English is not my first language, it can be challenging, but it's definitely worth reading in the original. I have a question for you and JVH. What do you think about the idea that the physiology of the judge, Holden, is a reference to Moby Dick? He is large and voluminous, pale, and with small hands and feet, and without any hair. Sounds a lot like a whale. I read it somewhere and find the idea that Judge Holden should be interpreted a combination of Moby Dick and Ahab really interesting. What do you think? I look forward to your next episode. Thanks for making them. Cheers, Jesper.
That's such a nice message.
Such a nice message.
Thanks, Jesper.
And we are going to touch on that. We're going to have a whole episode on whales and men, and that I think that would be a good episode for Moby Dick. I do feel he is a combination. I feel the judge is a combination of both, and the sum of my
Of
of
both the
both
whale and
Ahab.
Ahab.
Yes, sorry, and my summation. Their other connection. There's lots of words that are like Easter eggs that Shane Schimpf has found, and noted a couple of other writers that he really does bring in some of the same language into Blood Meridian that's found in Melville's. But I also think that Melville has written a morally cautionary tale about authoritarianism, and he was really trying to warn people about that. And I think that helps us interpret what Blood Meridian is about. Just we can put that out there as my opinion in the future. And we will get to that, Jesper. I think we're just going to give it a bit more of a dedicated episode rather than in this chapter, because we're going to talk about whales and men. Now, the other message was from a fellow called Ryan, and he DM'd us on our Instagram page. So we have supportive content on our Instagram page. Hey, I wanted to reach out to tell y'all that I just finished the first episode of the podcast and that I loved every second of it. I am super excited to continue listening, and just please know that you two have a massive fan with me.
Thanks, Ryan.
I know, Ryan. You just gave
Awesome.
such a boost. It made me really excited about doing the podcast today, just knowing, hey, someone's actually listening. So we
And writing in, that's super,
and
that's
writing in. If you get a
thoughtful.
chance,
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, just write us any kind of message. Just let us know you're out there. We'd love to hear from you. Um,
Yeah, I kind of, like I do agree that Judge Holden is kind of a combination of these two characters.
mm,
I think I've like written about this more than once that I
yeah,
don't, when I read like Blood Meridian and especially the characters of the kid and the judge, I don't really see them as whole persons. Like I don't see them really as realistic characters whose psychology I need to find out. Like again, McCarthy did not like Henry James, and so I don't think in general he likes psychology or he cares really about, delving into people's thoughts or whatever. In fact, like I found it interesting, like in general, the narrator is very objective, like sort of like a third person, not omniscient, because again, that would be too psychological,
mm,
but very much kind of at, just the facts, like as descriptive as possible. And even when the narrator gets inside the head of the kid or into, rather than describing the behavior of the kid, tries to describe the kid's experience, it's
mm,
still like fairly sober and, regulated. So, we read that when the kid took a drink of this um, mezcal that was poured for him at this bar, it tasted faintly of something, of creosote or something like that. So,
mm,
the narrator can go inside the kid's experience, but also just the physical sensations. Like the kid, we don't really know what he's thinking or feeling, if he's really conflicted emotionally about the stuff that's going on or anything like that. That really doesn't matter. It's what matters is, the behavior.
yeah,
And
that's a good
but
point.
yeah, anyways,
Uh,
I don't know. I think I kind
I,
of got distracted,
that's
but
okay.
the judge is a, an aquatic ape, makes total sense.
Hmm.
The paleness, the hairlessness, we might even like Moby Dick has described the whiteness of the whale as like the colorless all color of atheism, and there might be a argument to be made about the judge and as a kind of figure of a type of atheism maybe.
Maybe.
But I agree, in a way, like I also agree with, the judge as kind of Ahab. But then again, what is missing from the judge? The way, Ahab has his leg chomped off,
Mm,
and by Moby Dick, and sees Moby Dick as this, metaphysical evil in the world and wants to stamp it out. And so if Ahab is monomaniacal and kind of has this fixed idea that he sacrifices everything for, right? He's a commercial whaler and he's like basically like saying, fuck that, I'm going to go after this one whale because he is the representation of all that is wrong in the world, like, um, so what is the judge monomaniacal? Like, is he also pursuing one single agenda?
no,
And, that there
no.
might be an answer for that, right? Like,
Yeah.
he's, only when we rout out only when we subjugate the entirety of nature will we not be at jeopardy to be, killed by anything in it, So I don't know if he has a maybe his, his fixed idea is something like vulnerability or
I feel that
permeability.
that motive, though, is so similar. Ahab has it on a whale, the judge has it on everything.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
So, in that way, I would just say he expanded the idea of, Ahab, back then, people thought whales were scary and dangerous and evil. It was completely disturbing. I grew up near whales. I know they're peaceful. I know you can look them in the eye. They're gonna, yeah, maybe the orcas are gonna get their payback now with humans, and I say go for it. But in general, we know they just want to mind their own business, and that they are sentient beings. And Ishmael in the novel Moby Dick seemed to, obviously, he is really exploring all that, and he's a wonderful narrator. Whereas the narrator in Blood Meridian is not such a nice person. If we met them, they would be a racist pig. But, historically correct for if they're talking from that era. They're writing as if they're in 1850, so they're not unusual.
Sometimes
Sometimes,
like,
yes, sometimes,
sometimes the
sometimes.
narrator
You're
sounds
right.
like our contemporary, right?
It's so
Like,
true. I know it's
yeah.
mysterious, right? It's very mysterious. Yeah, very mysterious. So true. We were talking about you gave a good example of this subtle language the counters pushed across the bar. Hey, and there was that one paragraph that you read opening. It's got so much light and tension. It's like the kind of light that I used to say in Alberta, a farmer's going to go out and kill his wife. It's that sketchy 4 o'clock afternoon light that's very disturbing. It's like a glare. Um, and that letter, what you read was there's trembling, shadow, void, harried, wolves, the same color as Mesa, so they're cloaked, right? You can't even see the wolves almost. Invisible wolves, if you will. And then, what really got me was that the mountains were like butcher paper. Always, I thought that was quite a clever description because if you're in Albuquerque and you're looking at the mountains there, they do look a little bit, and actually,
Butcher papery. Yeah.
yeah, they are in New Mexico in this chapter, and it does have that thing of folded up butcher paper. However, that's a meat reference, right? It's like where's the meat going on that? It's going to be you guys. You guys are going to be the meat on that butcher paper. It's like, ugh,
Because it's a thirsty country.
thirsty.
Yeah, and like, and in a I don't know if it's before or after that passage, but there's also this, they pass through. I think they're passing through town or something, and they see like, or no, they're passing through an Apache camp maybe, and they abandoned camp, and they see like dried hides of meat hanging like strange dark laundry.
Yes.
So like meat again, like the meat, animal sacrifice, human sacrifice, altar stones, like ceremonies. Like it's just really quite amazing the way all of these like individual and seemingly disparate kind of terms that make up this chapter, they all like are working really together to create this kind of singularity of meaning that is so rich and that takes so much time and effort to kind of elaborate or
You're right.
unfold.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yeah, you
Yeah, sorry. I mean, um, in the first again in the first section of the chapter, like Toadvine talks a couple of times, and you were mentioning like um, the ongoing kind of like thematic obsession with ideas about race, and I guess like
hmm
you know, in terms of racial categories or racialized social types, I mean, we have the Anglo-Saxon, we have the African American, and we have the indigenous populations, and then we have the Mexican, right? And
Hill.
so
Yep.
America and Mexico, these are two European settler states.
Mm.
Um, and like talking about the way Toadvine talks, he refers to Mexicans as he uses a slur that is anti-black slur to describe
Right.
Mexicans. And
Right.
Glanton, when he gets not decapitated, but when his head gets split down the middle at the end, he conflates again an anti-black slur with a basically like anti-indigenous sentiment, right? Like
hmm
so these racial categories are like totally intertwined, even as they're kind of distinct. And so Toadvine using um, and the anti-black slur,
hmm
uh, also kind of, again, uh, in the second time he uses it, this is in reference to the old man talking about, um, you guys are Americans, blah blah blah, and he says, he calls the Mexican crazier than a fugitive slave, basically, right?
hmm
And that's to me that's again great writing because of what we talked about maybe last time, where the source of the name Toadvine comes from this plantation novel, The Master's House, and that Toadvine was an overseer, and a pursuer after fugitive slaves and stuff like that. So Toadvine using this anti-black slur, on the one hand, it again locates the genealogy of this character as coming from this novel, The Master's House, and on the other hand, it provides a nice vehicle for talking about the racial delirium
hmm
um, of this text.
Yeah, for sure. In chapter 7 too, we were talking about how the gun runner, uh, arms dealer was Jewish. And,
Right.
I kind of thought back on it, on their attitude. The gang, at some point when they're negotiating, the gang starts muttering obscenities. So that was a very good, they're building loyalty with each other against this guy selling them these guns for them to make a living. And that kind of hinted, I have no, I'm okay with the characters. I will say it is a mystery why the narrator is so racist. But I think maybe it is to have the realism of the time. I don't think it's McCarthy. I certainly don't feel that it's the writer. I feel he's up to something, and that's what we're trying to figure out. I think that the text, it's showing that the text is, we should be suspicious of the text as much as we love it and trust it.
I agree. I mean, to me, like the narrator can, that he has this variable temporal or historical bandwidth. So sometimes it's like this is a 19th century narrator, and sometimes it feels like this is a 20th century
Yeah.
narrator
So
because
true.
he's quoting T.S. Eliot and Nabokov, and he's making reference to World War II and the Holocaust or to Vietnam, blah blah
Yeah,
blah.
you're absolutely right. That's such a great.
But but I do think, like the racism of the narrator and the problematic parts of the narrator is also kind of maybe McCarthy's way of saying, uh, you are still complicit, and I am still complicit in this history of violence and this history of hatred and this history of blood. And to think that, this was then and now is now,
Yes.
that this is an untenable proposition, and
I
in part brought on by capitalism, because capitalism, in terms of time, well, I mean, is only interested in the present and in certain ways the future,
yes.
uh, not the past.
Well, you're right. And I think that that's a really good comparison between that essay, Capitalism as Religion. If it is a religion, if we passionately believe in it and we see no other way to live and we think it's the highest, most supreme way to make a living, we're unable to see outside of it. We have to chip away and see, wait a second, you have to contest yourself. And in the same way, the novel is working that way. And when we think, oh, it's so beautifully written, the prose is beautiful, which many, many people say, oh, it's biblical, oh, it's incantatory, it's florid, it's gorgeous. All of that is true, but it's not trustworthy. We have to be able to pick out those racist parts, and I do believe he did it on purpose. He is messing around with the historical history is written by the victors, and you have to contest the victor. You have to contest the narrator in this to get to the truth. You have to be suspicious of that voice as well as the action in the novel. And I
Yes.
think that's brilliant. I
And
think
to quote Benjamin's the last essay that he, I think, completed, which was an essay called On the Concept of History, or often translated as Theses on the Philosophy of History. Benjamin has this very famous and anthologizable quote. There is no document of civilization that is not at the same time a document of barbarism. So,
there you go.
this document of, the highest poetry,
Mhm.
the summation of 2,500 years of poetic diction and stuff like that, that it by dealing with the content that it deals with, it is saying that, yeah, this is a document of civilization, and this is what people can do in a civilized society if they choose to. They can sacrifice 7 years of their lives to put this novel together or whatever. It's still a document of barbarism, and barbarism made whatever civilizing effects the novel has possible in the first place. So we can't divorce ourselves from the barbarism that we have benefited from.
Right. And it's hard for us to tell a clear story. We're part of hard for us to outthink it. We can't know our heart. What's it? Can't know what that unreliable
Right.
quote said.
Yes.
We can't know who we are by, we've only got our own heart to measure it by, or
Well, we
this.
don't want to look inside our heart,
Right.
right? And
Right.
again, the heart as the organ of blood, and like we don't want to see the blood of 1,000 Christs that made this podcast episode possible.
Correct. And we can't know our own mind since we only have our own mind to measure it by, which would be that science parable of the observer in an experiment is also affecting the experiment, right? So,
Right.
and to underscore how much McCarthy likes science, he probably had that in his mind as well. Um, we've got so many notes here. We've talked
Oh,
about
and it knows.
ceremony, we've talked about blood and sacrifice. Um, there,
There is like it feels good when Black Jackson, you
yes.
know, just puts that annoying piece of shit
Oh
to
God,
rest.
yeah,
Like, and he White Jackson like has like two scenes in the novel, and
yeah.
I mean, I kind of like you hate him from the beginning, and you're you're glad to see him go, and there is that kind of like in a way, it's like nobody gets mad at Black Jackson for doing what he does. They just like are a little bit put out by the disgusting 4 ropes of blood, by the way, 4 ropes of
War
blood
blood. I love
squirting out of
right.
squirting out White Jackson's decapitated neck. Uh,
Yeah. Well, I'm sure at this point because I always like to think about what movies had Cormac McCarthy seen, and I'm thinking he must have seen Aguirre, Wrath of God, where a head gets chopped off in the middle of a card game, and I think that the head still is going like 4, 3, still counting on the sand or something. And we know later they
oh
actually
my
did know
God.
each other, but it would be hard for me not to imagine that he wouldn't have seen Aguirre, Wrath of God.
Well, he was buddies with Werner Herzog, so
Correct.
I
Correct.
think he must have done his research before
Oh,
actually talking with him.
yeah, but that was a huge movie of alternative movies at the time when he was a younger man. It would have been pretty trendy to go see that.
Oh yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
Klaus Kinski maybe could have made a good Glanton or something
Oh
like
God,
that.
he would have been amazing. And you know what? It's weird that Herzog didn't make Blood Meridian, but he kind of did with Fitzcarraldo and Aguirre. So, only he did it in South America. Um,
And the anti-Blood Meridian with my favorite of his films, the Caspar Hauser
oh, I
film.
love that movie.
It's so
Oh,
beautiful.
it's so
Yeah.
beautiful. In fact, I saw that movie and Strozek with my friend I mentioned back in
Oh yeah.
college. Yeah,
Yeah.
because we went to see Strozek because Ian Curtis, that was the last his favorite movie from Joy Division,
Oh really? Oh
and
okay.
apparently it was on the BBC that night, and then he killed himself. I was like,
Oh
I
wow.
can't believe we're going to
Sweet.
watch this movie, and then I'm going to see what it's all about. Yeah, that was at UVic many,
Oh.
many dim years ago. At my acting game of my portrayal of being a student. I just played one on TV. Hey.
I
Um,
recently, my parents came and visited me, and
oh
they brought me back like all my report cards from grade 1 to grade 11,
my God.
and it was an awesome revelation of how terrible a student I was.
Really? Really? Well, that's hilarious. Can you take a picture of one of them for our Instagram page or something? If you feel brave. But mine all said the same thing. If she would not look out the window and just apply herself, she'd be a really good student all the time. Every
Mine seems like ironic to me now, like because it's like he can't stop talking. If he could only stop talking, like and disrupting things, or if he only applied himself, he could
that
do
was
good things.
only applied herself. Same thing there. Same thing there. But I was always staring out the window, apparently.
So I have a note here about one thing that I thought was funny,
Yeah.
and again, like funny in McCarthy's sort of like deadpan, totally
Yes.
understated and almost invisible way. When White Jackson like threatens Black Jackson, to go to the other fire where, you know, the other non-white, non-Anglo-Saxon people are, and then the new recruits. He says, wait, let me quickly pull it
Yeah.
up. He says something like, Black Jackson says, "You aim to shoot me?" And the response from White Jackson is, "You don't get your black ass away from this fire, I'll kill you graveyard dead." So like
That's good.
graveyard dead
Mhm.
is you know that is like a redundant statement, right?
Yeah, it sure is.
It's what Zora Neale Hurston, the great anthropologist slash playwright slash novelist, their eyes were watching God. She had a bunch of, she was also a kind of literary critic and was trying to establish like a new aesthetic for Black writers.
Mm.
And she's talking about, as an anthropologist, she had to do really humiliating things, like go around New York City and measure the skulls of Black folks, because, even in anthropology in its earliest instances was totally racist, and so
Yes.
see whether Black people's brains were smaller than white
Mhm.
people's brains, right? And of course, like not surprisingly, there is no evidence of that. But anyways, like Hurston, and another kind of long-standing racist trope
Mhm.
is that you know Black people were, or Black Americans come from African slaves, and African slaves were, of course, forced to abandon their own languages and they were forced to adopt English.
Mhm.
And there was a long-standing racist trope that, the way black people spoke English was indicative of, their inferior intellect. They didn't do it right.
Mhm.
They didn't speak right.
Right.
And one part of Hurston's argument for black aesthetics is that actually, like, what you could call Black English or African American vernacular English, um, that this is actually in instance of of the originality of African American usages of English, and there are different kind of elements of African American vernacular English, one of them being the double descriptive. So graveyard dead, when
Mhm.
White Jackson says that, he's actually like using
Oh my God.
African American vernacular English or Black English as a,
Yeah.
he's in a racist context and,
Yes.
gets his head cut off for that.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I feel like that also is, McCarthy's probably chuckling to himself as
Yeah.
he's writing this and, stuff like that.
That's fabulous. And it goes back to the thing we were saying a couple weeks ago about most of our cultures from Black America. And that kind of language work is also a huge art form, like you said, and
There's
and
so many,
inventiveness,
there's so,
inventive.
yeah, it's so inventive. And, the way that I love that description of the two fires of the gang. There were no rules, real or tacit,
Correct.
as to who sits where. So that's really egalitarian, right?
It is. It is.
It doesn't matter if you're in the gang, you're in the gang. It doesn't matter, where you came from, what you are, racially speaking, or whatever, or ethnically speaking, or culturally speaking. It doesn't matter. And of course, it's not like truly egalitarian because, again, as the narrator says, all covenants are brittle
Hmm.
here beyond men's judgments, right? So it made total sense for Black Jackson to kill White Jackson, and there was no atonement necessary for that act, right? It just let's just carry on because, we're all going to die by the sword at some point, and as long as you're doing your job, it doesn't matter, about anything like that.
Right. 'Cause they all did agree to do this and to scalp and to help each other. So anything that stops that, like any kind of military operation, would be bad for the operation. Their lives depend on each other.
Yeah. So on the one hand, it's like totally egalitarian.
Yeah,
You know,
it's weird.
and I think like again, sort of like that's a way that McCarthy is in some ways kind of expressing his own real egalitarianism, but
Yes.
also tricking the reader because
Yes.
again, like we're like we're like cheering when Black Jackson kills White Jackson.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, Black Jackson is the fool, right? Who's more or less, and the judge's kind of tarot reading of Black Jackson's drawing of the fool card basically reveals that, in some ways, Holden knows what's going to happen and knows that Black Jackson will be the first to die
Yeah.
at the end, right? So, like, he's on the one hand, it's egalitarian. On the other hand, there's still this undercurrent of white betrayal.
Well, I think that that egalitarian sense that you have of the camaraderie and that they have to trust each other in the gang has affected why there isn't very much criticism, published criticism, dealing with race in Blood Meridian. You've got yours in the Elmore compilation book. Me making my comment at the in Omaha at the McCarthy Society when I called it colonizer speak, and I got booed for it. Not by everybody, but enough that I heard it. Or, somebody said that they Googled Black Lives Matter and Cormac McCarthy. And they went on and what came up was on the forum, and it was me with No Country for Old Men. I made a title, Black Lives Matter and No Country for Old Men. And so they came on there and they said, figures it was you, Candy, right?
That
But
was a good thread.
it was a good thread. Yeah. I wish we still had it. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to look at in the novel. And I think it has distracted the fact that, no one wants to call anybody a bad name. They want to believe they want to believe there's something about this novel that's valuable. And we know what it is, but very few people actually come out. Harold Bloom didn't really say it. He wrote a review, oh, well, it's Gnostic. The judge is the greatest character in American literature in the last 30 years or whatever. But this is part of getting into it. This is part of it. It's part of what we unconsciously probably love about it, is that it is a mystery. We're like detectives. You've got a murder board. We're trying to figure it out, you know? And,
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is kind of said, at least, fairly frequently, I don't have like statistics or anything, is the idea that Blood Meridian is to be praised because it is a revisionary Western,
yes.
and but revisionary in the specific sense that it doesn't portray the indigenous people like the Apache or the Comanche. It doesn't portray them as you know noble savages. It just portrays them kind of on par with the violence of the Glanton gang. I kind of I want to take a different kind of tack. I do want to, like in some ways, like I think Blood Meridian should be critiqued in the same way that you could critique the movie Oppenheimer, the more recent movie Oppenheimer, that kind of like an American narcissistic self-reflection on the guilt of creating the atomic bomb, as opposed to like, you know, including a whole parallel plot about like Japanese people who like had to suffer from the consequences of this, and or like Stanley Kubrick, who I absolutely adore and love, and Full Metal Jacket is like a great kind of maybe anti-war, I think anti-war Vietnam War movie. But again, it's completely and entirely from the perspective of the Americans. There's no Homeric attempt to, look at both sides and, judge impartially like Homer was able to do with the Greeks and the Trojans, or anything like that. So there is a kind of perhaps a critique that one could launch against Blood Meridian's representation of all sorts of indigenous peoples in this novel. But
Absolutely. I
you know,
absolutely agree with you.
like still, like maybe also, I don't, again, speculating on authorial intention might be kind of useless, but maybe there's a kind of reticence also on the part of McCarthy to, you know, to, too much try to represent um, a perspective that never was his own and never could be his own.
Mm,
But there are kind of interesting sort of hints of a kind of um, undercurrent of what might be called indigenous survivance in the novel. And one of them is, like the again going back to this Mexican kind of advisor figure in the first section of the chapter, he mentions Gomez, right?
I was just about to ask you about Gomez. Yeah,
Like
I was
even
to ask
you
you what.
kill Gomez, even Gomez, who can ride against the Texans. They are soldiers. You know, the blood of Gomez, the blood of the country, or something like that. And Gomez was uh, an Apache leader. I'm like I want to like say at the outset, I'll talk about this more in future podcasts too, but the particular Apache band or tribe that Gomez belonged to are the Mescalero.
Yes.
And the Mescalero had a really interesting kind of social system that was really truly egalitarian. And you could leave a band whenever you felt like. There was no real like social hierarchy in bands. You could start your own band, and Gomez is a leader, and so but leadership in the Mescalero context is really kind of interesting. the leader wasn't the one who had the most resources, or anything like that. Like the leader was as resource rich or poor as everyone else. But what made for a leader was the ability to speak articulately. So, like, the power of speech
Mhm.
was the sign of, true leadership, which is again like a totally anti-American, anti-European kind of conception of leadership, especially, uh, under capitalism, where really like it's money and power that makes you a leader. Like, I mean, look at the leader of the United States. He's a total inarticulate buffoon, um, but he has power and he has money, and so I guess the Americans think that that's enough
Mhm.
uh, to make for a statesman.
Mhm.
But anyway, so even this mention of Gomez, like just passing, right? You know, this is the only novel, or before Blood Meridian, McCarthy has said that he didn't really research
Mhm.
much in writing his novels, but Blood Meridian he had to research. So he researched, like this, and I'm sure like he's reading about Gomez, the Mescalero, their, social organization, which is kind of like anarchistic and stuff like that. And, he has these little phrases that he'll pop in, McCarthy, and he'll be like, here's a weird word or here's a name. And like, reader, it's kind of up to you uh, to look into this
Absolutely.
and to actually, if you really want to know what's going on in this novel, you yourself need to do. You need to follow the trail that I followed, and you need to do the research as well. And then when you do the research, um, then knowledge of the text can become possible.
Absolutely. I think that's why you've got to start to realize the suspicion of the narrator, and that does drive you into it. And
Yeah.
there's the stereotype, we've talked about the stereotype. Many cultures were not necessarily violent and warring. Most of the time, it's only when you're pushed against the wall, right? When you have so much resources and so much space, you don't really need to have a lot of war. Maybe if you need to get new family members to get healthier children, that could happen. If there wasn't a ritual to have courtship, you might have to go to military to bring in new cousins and nephews and wives and husbands. But yeah, the stereotype that every First Nation, every Indigenous person was violent and war-bound, it's not true. In fact, there's one group, and it might have been Apaches, who, when the Spanish came over with horses, they had been farmers. They had been living subsistence farming, but once they had horses, they returned to being hunter and gatherers. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the community, but and maybe they weren't. They would have been maybe more like trading. And okay, we'll have a conversation. I need bread, you need beads, I need fur, you need boots. Um, it was partly could have been driven by the violence of the Spaniards and colonizers and Europeans and British coming that so-called they're so violent. So all of that
Yes.
is important to the story for sure.
Yes. Yes. It's
For
it is
sure.
so much. Yeah.
Yep. And the novel is playing on our own preconceived stereotypes of what we look for and question. Absolutely. Oh my God, we had so much on this in this chapter, which is such a surprise because it started out like it's only a few pages. What are we talking about? But it is almost like it's put in there as well so that you can start to assimilate some of these things. And it kept making me think about chapter 7. And then, oh, we got a cat. Hello, that's the cat. Sorry. And then going into chapter 9, it's really feeding in. It's getting you through that. I love how it ends on, and then they met
Yeah.
the Apaches.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
feeding on our stereotypes. Well, is it going to be good or bad?
It can't be
Scary or
good.
not? Scary or not? Yes.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I had that when we were talking earlier. I was saying like some chapters have this kind of like end stopped feel. Like in poetry, a line can be end stopped, and like, okay, that line is ended. Now let's move on to the next line. And so like a lot of the chapters do have that kind of end stopped feel, but this chapter feels like an enjambment, right? Or enjambment,
Yes.
where it's like they had not gone forth 1 hour upon that plain before they were ridden upon by the Apaches. And so it's immediately going to go into like
It's
that,
and
like
a
in the next
cliffhanger.
chapter.
I stopped. I didn't go
Yeah,
to
it
the
is a
next page,
cliffhanger.
but I was like, damn, I want to keep reading. But I was like, no, I'm sticking with our plan here.
Blood Meridian really should be a television series.
I
It's
can
never going to work as a film
it should
ever.
be a television series, and they should listen to our podcast to help line it all up.
It's really true, yeah. And so one of the episodes could be 7 and 8, right?
Yeah,
Chapter seven
it
and
could
eight,
be
and it ends with this cliffhanger.
correct. Correct. I agree. I really wish it had been especially with all the streaming services and how many fans love this book. It would have been so great to give it a mini series.
Come on,
Well,
HBO
make it
Max.
12 episodes if you don't want to do it, but 24 would be so nice.
Oh yeah.
And then one on whales and men. No, just kidding.
No, that's our idea.
That's our idea. We gotta
Trademark.
we have to work on that pretty soon.
That's true, yeah. But
Oh,
uh,
we have to
I'm
negotiate.
drowning in work right now. So
Wasn't
speaking of
it,
the sea,
I know, isn't it sad? You choose your work so that you could be free to be, oh, I'm gonna explore. Like you know what I read? You're gonna be so mad at me. I read J.T. Fraser's Of Time, Passion, and
passion
Knowledge.
and knowledge. Nice. You read the whole thing?
Where
That's
did
like 900 pages.
Oh, it was like 900 pages. Um, it's a little dated. He did not delve into Buddhism properly. He kind of wrote off Asian, and when he said Babylonia created a sundial and a vertical,
Oh, right. Yeah, he does have that whole clockmaking
yeah,
time
he was a
section.
clockmaker. He was a
He
clockmaker.
was? Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I mean, it's an incredible act of showing his mind. He had such a vast mind and knowledge. I'm so impressed. He would have been a great person to have at a dinner party, I guess. Your
Yeah, no
family
kidding.
dinner party. And I do like it. I did find it ethnocentric. And, of course, the stupa is 5,000 years old at least. And he didn't say the Antikythera because I'm always like looking in the index. Did he say this? He did the Antikythera mechanism, which made me wonder maybe it hadn't been called that in the 70s. But he does mention it.
Oh, yeah.
Mentions that it was described and that somebody stumbled upon it. But it's really only a paragraph. However, most of the research on the Antikythera mechanism has come out since then when they had all kinds of ways that took so long to get people to decipher it and translate it. So, and it's still not completely deciphered. And to realize that it had so many gears, at first they just really didn't get it, I don't think.
Hmm.
But anyway, it was a really fantastic book, which I don't know. I read it at work.
Wow.
I
Yeah,
did read
it's
it at work,
it's it's
and I
pretty
was laid up
cool.
with a
I mean,
broken toe.
you got to do something when you're
To
laid
do
up.
something, yeah.
Yeah, like it's a pretty cool like time as conflicts or like there's not time is not one thing, but it's actually several things.
Mhm.
They're like different levels of temporality, starting with I don't know the pro like no, it's like the atemporal, and then every level of time also comes with its own Umwelt or world.
Belt. I know I had to look that up.
So there's which comes from yeah like German ethology like Jakob von
You're right. Yes.
Uexküll or something like that.
Impressive, JV.
Um,
You know it all. You know that. That's so good. I really had to look up a lot of words and stuff. Although the time part I felt pretty confident about. And of course, I don't believe in time. I think it's a social construct, which sort of, I guess, is what he meant by conflict when he says time is conflict, because it is so many things to different people.
yeah, yep.
And I don't think that should be our bonding, our international bonding platform. We'll just argue about it, right?
Ah, yeah.
But yeah, it does suck. Well, we've talked about this before. It's why lay people discover things. There's all the people, astronomers aren't discovering stars or things. It's the guy who, or woman who's like, oh, part-time hobby with their telescope. And because they have the free time. The professors are bogged down. Not fair.
It's not fair at all.
No, no. But
Or, I
thank
mean,
God
but
for your lucky students and they get to have you.
I shouldn't complain.
Well,
Um,
you can complain. It's hard. It's hard. But it is work that you love, and that's a good thing. And you've improved your attitude in your school life, according to your report cards. So funny.
that is hilarious.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, your parents must be like, what the hell happened? We thought he was going to be a terrible student, end up in prison, and yet actually a teacher. Are you going to show your students your report cards? No. Well, we have been here for a couple of hours, so
Oh my God. Yeah.
I guess we'll save it for another episode.
We're really testing the limits of our two listeners.
I know. Thank you so much for
Thank you so much.
again. And again, check out our Substack, check out our Instagram if you can, and see you later. Talk to
Yeah.
you later. Thanks,
Bye.
JPH.
Thanks,
Bye.
Candy. Bye.